It was a cold, quiet evening in the small town of Jefferson Hill. The streets were empty, shops had closed early, rain fell gently on the sidewalks, and streetlights glowed like soft candles. An elderly black woman walked slowly down the street. Her name was Miss Hattie Cole. She carried a cloth shopping bag with a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, and some fruit. She was dressed neatly, a long dark coat, old leather shoes, and a gray hat that covered her silver hair. Her steps were slow but steady. At 78 years old, Miss Hattie still walked to the store by herself. She had done it for years. This was her neighborhood. These were her streets. But tonight something felt different. From across the street, a police car slowed down. Inside sat Officer Blake, a 27-year-old cop, new to the job and eager to prove himself. He had just received a report. Suspicious person, possibly homeless, seen walking near closed shops. Blake saw Miss Hattie walking alone and frowned. Could be her, he muttered. He hit the brakes and turned on his lights. The red and blue flashes lit up the dark street. Miss Hattie stopped and turned, confused. She had done nothing wrong. Still, she waited calmly as the car stopped in front of her. Officer Blake stepped out quickly. Hey, you there, stop walking. Miss Hattie raised her hand slightly. I'm not walking, sir. I'm standing still. Blake walked toward her, hand near his belt. What are you doing out here? He asked sharply. Just coming from the store, she replied softly, lifting her bag to show him. Do you live around here? Yes. Just down the street. Been here 42 years? Blake didn't believe her. He looked her up and down. Old coat, worn shoes, baggy clothes. To him, she looked out of place. You have ID? He asked. Miss Hattie blinked. I didn't bring my wallet. I just came to buy bread. Blake's tone grew harder. No ID, no proof of address. That's suspicious. He grabbed her bag and looked inside. Bread, milk, apples, a small envelope with a church bulletin. He threw the items back in the bag. What church bulletin is this? Who gave it to you? Miss Hattie looked hurt. That's my church. I go every Sunday. Put your hands behind your back, Blake said. Miss Hattie took a small step back, confused. Sir, I didn't do anything. I'm just trying to get home. I said put your hands behind your back. Without warning, Blake grabbed her arm and pushed her against the wall. The bag dropped to the ground. The bread rolled into a puddle. Miss Hattie gasped, but didn't fight back. Her body trembled. Across the street, a young man and woman watched in shock. The man pulled out his phone and started recording. Hey, leave her alone. She's an old lady, Blake shouted. Stay back, Miss Hattie whispered. Please, I can't lift my arms that high. But Blake didn't listen. He tightened the grip. More people began to gather. A woman screamed, That's Miss Hattie. What are you doing? Blake paused. Miss who? The young woman stepped closer, tears in her eyes. Miss Hattie Cole. She's a hero in this town. Blake looked confused. What are you talking about? Miss Hattie turned her head slowly and said the first sharp words of the night. You don't know who I am, do you? Her voice wasn't angry, that it was calm. Cold, strong. Blake hesitated. Should I? By now? At least 5 people were filming. One teenage boy said. She marched with Dr. King. You're arresting a civil rights legend. Blake's eyes widened. What? Another man added. That's Hattie Cole, man. She was on the news in the 60s. She's got a street named after her in Atlanta. Blake's hand slowly dropped from her wrist. He stepped back. The crowd pressed in. Someone shouted, You just assaulted history. Another said, You messed up, bro. Big time. Miss Hattie slowly bent down and picked up her bag, now wet and torn. The apples were bruised. The milk carton had cracked, but she didn't cry. She looked at Blake one last time and said, The problem isn't that you didn't know me. The problem is that you didn't even see me. Then she turned and walked away. The crowd stayed silent as she moved through them. No one tried to stop her. No one dared to speak. Blake stood frozen in the middle of the street, face pale, eyes wide. His radio crackled. Unit 14. What's your status? But he didn't answer. He couldn't move. He had just attacked an innocent elderly woman. And not just any woman, but a woman who had once stood on the front lines of history. By the next morning, the video had spread across the internet. Over 2 million views in 12 hours. The title on one post read, Young cop roughs up 78-year-old civil rights hero. Blake's name trended. Miss Hattie's name trended higher. But Miss Hattie, she sat in her small living room, holding a warm cup of tea. The bruises on her wrist were starting to show, but her eyes were calm. Her granddaughter sat beside her and asked, Grandma, why didn't you yell at him? Miss Hattie smiled gently. Because I've seen worse, baby, and I've learned. Silence can be louder than shouting. The video spread like wildfire. By morning, every major news channel was talking about it. Talk show hosts, influencers, and even civil rights leaders were reposting it with one question. Do you know who this woman is? In the video, you could clearly hear her calm voice. You could see the young officer grabbing her wrists. And then that moment when she looked him in the eye and said, You don't know who I am, do you? Across the country, people watched the clip again and again. Some felt anger, some felt shame, but most felt one thing: respect, because the woman who had been pushed and humiliated didn't fight back with fists or hate. She fought back with silence, with strength. with dignity. And people noticed. At a cafe nearby, a woman named Lana held her phone tightly. She was in her 40s, with curly hair and brown eyes. Tears welled up as she watched the video. "That's Miss Hattie," she whispered. The man beside her leaned in. "You know her?" "Yes, she was my neighbor when I was little. She used to teach us history in the park. She told us stories about marching, about standing up without violence, and now this. This is how they treat her." She posted the video with her own caption. "This woman taught me more about bravery than any school ever did." Hashtag Hattie Cole at the local high school. A teacher named Mr. Daniels paused his lesson. He showed the class the video. The students watched in silence. Then one girl raised her hand. "She looks familiar. I think she spoke at my church once." Another said, "Isn't she the lady from that mural downtown, with the flowers and the torch?" Mr. Daniels nodded. "Yes, her name is Harriet Hattie Cole. She marched in Alabama, got arrested at 17, stood beside Martin Luther King Jr. during the Peace Walk in Selma." The students gasped. One whispered, "She's a hero." By the afternoon, the whispers had grown louder. Local news aired a segment, "Hattie Cole, the Forgotten Hero." Photos flashed on the screen, a black and white image of a young girl sitting in a jail cell with a book in her hands, another of her holding a sign that said "We March for Justice," and a recent one gray-haired, smiling gently, standing in front of a small church. The reporter said, "Hattie Cole has been a quiet symbol of peace and strength in this town for over 50 years. But now, she's making headlines again for a reason that has shaken this community." In a small shop near downtown, the owner taped a printed message to his window. "We stand with Miss Hattie, a voice of peace, a woman of history." Others followed. Bakers, florists, libraries and gas stations began placing signs that said, "Justice for Miss Hattie. Honor her, don't harm her, know her story." At the police station, Officer Blake sat in the chief's office. He looked pale. Sweat formed at his temples. The video played on the screen in front of him. The chief, a heavy-set man with gray hair, watched without saying a word. When the clip ended, the chief turned slowly and asked, "Do you know who she is now?" Blake's voice cracked. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand what you did?" "Yes, sir." "You didn't just embarrass this department. You assaulted one of the most respected women in the state." "She's in textbooks." "Blake, textbooks." Blake lowered his eyes. The chief leaned forward. "You didn't see a person. You saw a problem, and now, you're the problem." That evening, Miss Hattie sat on her porch with a blanket over her knees. She sipped her tea quietly. Her bruised wrist rested on a pillow. Beside her, her granddaughter, Camille, sat close, scrolling on her phone. "Grandma, your video's everywhere. Look, people are posting photos from when you were young." Miss Hattie smiled softly but said nothing. Camille read out loud. "This one says," she didn't shout. She didn't push. She just stood tall. "We need more Miss Hatties." Another tweet said, "The police should be protecting women like her, not hurting them." Hashtag Justice for Hattie. Camille looked up, eyes filled with emotion. "Aren't you mad, Grandma?" Miss Hattie placed her hand on Camille's. "I've been mad before, but anger burns too fast. It fades. What stays is purpose." The next day, something surprising happened. A large group of students, teachers, and neighbors gathered outside Miss Hattie's house. They brought flowers, cards, and candles. Camille opened the door and gasped. Miss Hattie came out slowly, leaning on her cane. The crowd clapped. No one shouted. No one made noise. They simply stood in silence. For her, a young girl stepped forward and said, "Miss Hattie, thank you, not just for what you did yesterday, but for everything you've done for years." The girl handed her a small sign that read, "We see you now." Inside the Jefferson Hill police station, the air was heavy. Whispers passed between officers like small waves. Some stared at their desks, some stared at their phones, and some watched the video of Officer Blake Egan roughly grabbing the old woman on the rainy sidewalk. But today, the video was more than just a clip. It was a mirror showing them something uncomfortable. Detective Lisa Monroe, one of the few black officers in the department, sat at her desk watching in silence. Her eyes didn't blink. Her hands were tight. She had seen police disrespect before, but this was something else. She pressed pause on the video, leaned closer and whispered to herself, "Wait a minute. Is that?" She quickly stood up and walked straight to the chief's office. Chief Reynolds looked up from behind his desk. "Lisa," she held her phone out, showing him the paused video. "That woman Blake pushed you. You know who she is?" He nodded. Double quotes, "Yeah, the name's all over the news now. Hattie Cole." Lisa took a deep breath. "Chief, I know her. I mean really know her." She sat down and began to tell him. "When I was 13, I was angry. At school, at life, at everything. I was skipping class, fighting, stealing gum from the store. One day this old woman stopped me outside a church. She didn't yell, she didn't grab me. She just looked at me and said, 'You have fire in your eyes. Use it for light, not destruction.' That woman changed me." The chief listened, quiet. Lisa added, "And I remember her name, Harriet Cole. I went home and Googled her. I cried that night." She pulled out an old manila folder from her bag. Inside were photocopies of newspaper. clippings. She spread them out on the chief's desk. One showed a black and white photo of a 17-year-old girl being dragged by police dogs in Birmingham. Gert's face was cut, but her hand still held a sign that read, "We are human too." Another article showed a picture of her standing beside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1965 Selma March. Lisa pointed. "That's her, that's Miss Hattie." The chief leaned back. Stunned, he stared at the photo, then at Lisa. Then he looked at the video playing again on his laptop. Officer Blake, young and nervous, gripping the wrist of a woman who had once stood against dogs and guns and didn't flinch. He muttered, "We messed up." Lisa didn't reply. They both knew. At that moment, Blake sat alone in the locker room, scrolling through his phone in silence. The noise from the world was loud now. He grabbed a civil rights legend. How could a cop be so blind? That man hurt Miss Hattie Cole. Every comment hit him like a punch. He clicked on an old interview of Miss Hattie from 1998. Her voice was calm, wise, and powerful. "They spat on us, beat us, but we stood anyway. Not because we were fearless, but because someone had to stand." Blake lowered the phone, his hand shaking. He had just laid hands on someone who had already survived so much. Later that day, the mayor of Jefferson Hill called an emergency press conference. The small room was packed, cameras clicked, voices whispered. People waited. Mayor Kelly stepped up to the mic. "Good evening. Today, our city was reminded of something painful. That sometimes, we forget the faces that built our freedom." She took a deep breath. Hattie Cole is not just an elderly woman walking home. She is a civil rights icon, a living piece of American history, and what happened to her is a shame we must face. Behind her stood Detective Lisa Monroe, holding a framed photo of young Hattie during the Selma March. The crowd clapped softly. Some cried. The mayor ended with, "From today, June 20th, will be known as Hattie Cole Day in Jefferson Hill, a day of peace, learning, and remembrance." Meanwhile, in her small home, Miss Hattie sat by the window, watching birds gather near her garden. Camille read the mayor's words aloud from her phone. Miss Hattie smiled gently. "They're finally remembering." Camille looked up. "How does it feel, Grandma?" Miss Hattie thought for a moment. "Strange. I didn't fight to be remembered. I fought so people like you could forget what it felt like to be feared." Camille hugged her tight. That night, Blake knocked on his parents' door and collapsed in their arms. His father said, "What were you thinking?" Blake could only say one thing. "I didn't see her for who she was. And I don't think I've really seen anyone in a long time," his mother whispered. "Then start now." Across the country, schools began teaching Hattie's story again. Old interviews were pulled from archives. Her books were sold out online. A documentary team reached out to her family. The world had almost forgotten her, but now, they couldn't stop talking about her. And behind it, all behind the trending posts and the speeches, was a simple truth. One young cop didn't know her name, but now, the whole world did. It had been 48 hours since the video of Officer Blake roughing up Miss Hattie went viral. In just 2 days, the quiet little town of Jefferson Hill had changed. The people were no longer silent. The streets were no longer calm. The city was rising. On the front lawn of City Hall, people gathered with handmade signs. "Honor Hattie Cole. She marched for us. Justice for a living legend." Teachers brought their students. Pastors brought their churches. Parents brought their children. Everyone stood together, not in anger, but in unity. A local reporter held a mic to an elderly man standing in the crowd. His voice was rough but proud. "I was 10 when she marched through Birmingham. My mama made me hold her hand. She told me that woman's got more courage in her bones than most men have in their hearts. And now look." A cop grabs her like she's trash. "Nah, not on my watch." At Jefferson Hill High School, the principal stopped the morning bell. She gathered the students in the gym. A large projector showed a short documentary about Miss Hattie Cole's life. Photos of her protesting at 17, black and white videos of her giving speeches, her standing beside Martin Luther King Jr., holding a sign that read, "We walk so others may run." The students watched in silence. One boy leaned over to his friend. "That's the lady from the video." His friend whispered back, "Yeah, and we treated her like she was nobody." Outside Miss Hattie's home, a different kind of crowd had formed. Quiet, peaceful, respectful. People left candles, flowers, letters, and drawings. One small boy left a crayon sketch of her smiling. The note on it said, "Thank you for walking so I could go to school." Inside, Miss Hattie sat in her favorite chair. Her body still ached, but her heart felt full. She stared out the window at the people outside. Camille stood nearby, reading messages from social media. "Grandma, listen to this one. I never knew her name until this week. Now I'll never forget it. Hattie Cole is American history." Another one said, "My mom marched with her. I just called her and cried. Thank you, Miss Hattie." Camille looked at her grandmother. "How do you feel, Grandma? Everyone's watching you now." Miss Hattie smiled softly. "Strange child. I walked for years, and no one looked. Now I sit in a chair, and they finally see me." She paused. "But maybe it's not about them seeing me. Maybe it's about them seeing themselves." Meanwhile, at the Jefferson Hill police station, things were tense. Officer Blake had been placed on leave. No badge, no patrol, just silence. He sat alone in his apartment, watching the news. His face was pale, his hands shook. Reporters played clips of Hattie Cole's speeches from decades ago. In one she said, "We don't need pity, we need fairness. We don't need to be feared. We need to be seen." Blake turned off the TV. His world had flipped. The woman he had judged in seconds was now a national icon, and he was the man who didn't recognize her in the mayor's office. Mayor Kelly held a meeting with community leaders, teachers, activists, business owners, police. The mood was serious. Mayor Kelly stood in front of a chalkboard with a single question written. How do we make it right? People gave ideas. A new day in her honor. A statue in the city park. Free public education events about civil rights. Then a quiet voice spoke. It was Detective Lisa Monroe. Those are good, but none of them fix what she felt that night. Alone, afraid, disrespected, she looked around the room. We don't just honor Miss Hattie. We protect every other Miss Hattie walking home today. The room clapped. Later that evening, Miss Hattie received a knock on her door. Camille opened it carefully. It was the mayor. Behind her were several reporters, a cameraman, and a bouquet of white roses. Mayor Kelly stepped inside slowly, respectfully. Miss Hattie, she began, on behalf of the city of Jefferson Hill, I want to say I'm sorry. Miss Hattie said nothing at first. Then she gestured toward the couch. They sat together. The mayor continued. We want to rename the downtown square after you. We want to make your story part of every school lesson. And we want to ask, what do you want? Miss Hattie looked out the window at the flowers, the signs, the faces. She whispered, I want this moment to mean something. Not just for me, but for every tired soul who ever had to prove they were worthy of respect. The mayor nodded with tears in her eyes. That night, the city of Jefferson Hill turned off its usual lights. Instead, they lit candles across downtown. Each candle carried a small note that said, We see you, Hattie Cole. Back in her home, Miss Hattie sat by the window. The glow of candles filled the street. Camille leaned against her shoulder. Grandma, you did this. You made the world stop and listen. Miss Hattie smiled. No, baby. The world just needed a reminder. She closed her eyes and whispered, and sometimes the softest voices leave the deepest echoes. Officer Blake Carter sat alone in his small apartment. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of his refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. The badge that once sat proudly on his table was gone. Suspended, no uniform, no duty, just silence and guilt. He stared at the paused video on his laptop screen, his hand gripping the wrist of a frail old woman, a woman whose name now echoed across the country, Miss Hattie Cole. He replayed the moment for the 100th time. Her voice, in his head, wouldn't stop repeating, You don't know who I am, do you? And she was right. He didn't. He had only seen what he expected to see. An old woman, walking slowly, without ID. He hadn't seen the strength in her back, the wisdom in her eyes, or the scars of someone who had survived more than he could imagine. Later that day, Blake visited his parents' house. He hadn't been there in weeks. His father opened the door with a stern face. His mother, quiet but kind, hugged him without saying a word. They sat down at the kitchen table. Nobody spoke at first. Finally, his father said, You embarrassed us, Blake. Blake nodded. I know. His mom placed a newspaper in front of him. The front page showed a young Hattie Cole being dragged by police dogs and, next to it, a photo of Blake grabbing her wrist, a painful echo of the past. That's history repeating, she whispered, and you're part of it. That night, Blake sat on the edge of his childhood bed, surrounded by old boxers. He opened one labeled Grandma's Things. Inside were photos, letters, and a dusty black and white journal. He flipped through it and stopped on a photo of his grandmother standing beside a woman holding a sign. He looked closer. The woman beside his grandmother was young Hattie Cole. He gasped. She knew her. He flipped to a letter written in 1989. Dear Hattie, I'll never forget the day we stood together in Montgomery. You were just 19, but you stood like a lion. I thank God for you every day. Love, Mary Carter. Mary Carter, his grandmother. Blake clutched the letter tightly. His family had marched with Miss Hattie and, now, he had humiliated her. The next morning, Blake walked quietly through downtown Jefferson Hill. He wore no uniform. No badge. Just a plain jacket and jeans. People stared. Some whispered, some glared. He passed a mural on a brick wall, Miss Hattie's face painted in bold colors, with the words, She stood for peace. They pushed her anyway. Blake lowered his head. Then he heard a voice behind him. Officer Carter. He turned. It was a teenage girl holding her phone. Are you gonna say sorry? Blake didn't know how to answer. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck. He simply nodded and walked away. That afternoon he stood outside Miss Hattie's church. A small group of women were setting up chairs for a youth event. One of them saw him and frowned. You shouldn't be here. I know, Blake said softly. I want to talk to her. She's resting. You've done enough. Blake lowered his eyes. Please, just 5 minutes. Miss Hattie was inside, sitting in a wooden pew near the front. The church smelled of old wood and candle wax. Camille was beside her, helping her sort mail and letters. When Blake stepped in, Camille stood protectively. "What are you doing here?" "I'm not here as a cop," he said. "I'm here as a man who made the worst mistake of his life." Miss Hattie looked up slowly, her eyes locked with his. He stepped forward, then dropped to his knees beside the pew. "Miss Hattie, I'm sorry. I saw you, but I didn't see you. I judged you, and I disrespected everything you've lived through. I was blind and arrogant." The church was quiet. Miss Hattie didn't speak for a moment. Then she asked, "What's your name?" He blinked. Blake Carter." She raised her eyebrows. "Carter. Mary Carter's grandson." He gasped. "Yes. You knew her?" Miss Hattie smiled gently. "She walked beside me in Selma. She gave me her scarf when mine was torn. She was brave, strong, and kind." She paused. "She would be heartbroken to see what you did." Blake's shoulders fell. "I know. I've failed her too." Miss Hattie looked at him. Really looked at him. Not with hate, but with the deep sadness of someone who had lived through history and watched it repeat. She finally spoke. "You want to make it right?" Blake nodded quickly. "Yes, anything." She pointed toward the back of the church. "There's a youth group here every Saturday. Kids with pain, anger, and no place to put it. You start by listening to them. Then maybe you'll begin to understand me." Blake nodded, holding back tears. He stood and said, "I'll be here every Saturday." Miss Hattie nodded once. "We'll see." As he walked out, Camille looked at her grandmother. "Why'd you let him in?" Miss Hattie replied. "Because someone gave me a second chance once. It would be selfish not to pass it on." That evening, Blake stood in his apartment and stared at the mirror. He saw the man who had made a terrible mistake, but for the first time, he also saw the man who could change, and that was the beginning. 1 week later, on a quiet Saturday morning, Blake Carter returned to the small church on Pine Street. His hands were sweaty, his heart was heavy. He wore no police badge, just jeans and a plain t-shirt. This time, he didn't come to give orders. He came to listen. Inside, the church basement was filled with voices and laughter. The weekly youth group had already started. Kids from the neighborhood sat in a big circle, playing games and eating snacks. On one side of the room, Miss Hattie Cole sat in her wooden chair, with a blanket over her legs, watching them like a proud grandmother. She saw Blake walk in, and for a moment, the room went quiet. One of the boys muttered, "That's the cop from the video." Another whispered, "What's he doing here?" Blake walked toward Miss Hattie slowly, holding a brown paper bag. He stopped in front of her. "I brought tea, the kind you like. Peppermint." Miss Hattie didn't smile. She simply nodded to the chair beside her. "Sit." He sat quietly while the group continued their activities. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. After an hour, Miss Hattie finally turned to him. "What did you learn so far?" Blake looked at her. "They laugh. They argue. They joke. But every one of them is carrying something. Pain, anger, fear. And most of them don't trust people in uniforms." Miss Hattie nodded. "Now you know why I started this group." She paused. "And why I didn't call the police that night, even when you pushed me." Blake lowered his head. "I don't expect forgiveness." Miss Hattie looked straight ahead. "Forgiveness is not something you ask for with your mouth. You ask for it with your actions." From that day on, Blake began coming to the church every Saturday. He helped set up chairs. He passed out snacks. He picked up trash and played board games with the kids. At first, many avoided him, but slowly, one by one, they started talking to him. One afternoon, a boy named Tyrell, just 13, asked Blake, "You ever arrested someone who didn't do nothing?" Blake looked him in the eye. "Yes, and I still carry it with me every day." Tyrell nodded. "Good, you should." Another day, a girl named Maya gave Blake a drawing. It showed Miss Hattie as a superhero, holding a shield with the word justice on it. Next to her was a smaller character, Blake, holding a notebook that said learning. "This is you," Maya said. "You're not the villain anymore. But you're not a hero yet either." Blake smiled sadly. "That's fair." One evening, after most of the kids had gone home, Blake stayed back to clean. Miss Hattie watched him silently from her chair. Finally, she said, "You're changing." Blake looked up. "I'm trying." She nodded. "Trying is a start, but change only matters if it reaches others too." She handed him a worn photo. It was of her, age 19, standing in a protest line, bruised but proud. "I wasn't much older than you when I learned how ugly the world could be, but I also learned something else." She looked him in the eye. "The same hands that hurt can also heal, if they choose to." Blake held the photo like it was made of gold. "I want to be better, Miss Hattie. I want to stand on the right side of history." She looked at him for a long time. Then finally, smiled just a little, "Then start walking. And don't stop." The next morning, Miss Hattie invited Blake to speak with her at a local school. He stood beside her in the gym as she told her story to rows of students. Then she stepped aside and let Blake talk. He looked out at the young faces and said, Week ago, I thought I knew what justice looked like. I thought power meant control. But then I met someone who had power without needing to raise her voice." He paused. "I hurt someone who deserved honor, not harm. But she didn't destroy me. She taught me." The students clapped slowly, unsure at first, then louder. Blake looked at Miss Hattie. She gave a small nod of approval. That nod meant more to him than any badge or award. By the end of the week, the story of Blake's change had started to spread. News stations reported officer who assaulted civil rights legend now serving her mission. Social media comments shifted, at least he's learning. This is how you make things right. She turned her enemy into an ally, and at the heart of it all was Miss Hattie. One night, after youth group, Camille sat next to her grandmother. You think people really change? Miss Hattie looked out the window at the moonlight. Some do, but only when they're willing to carry the weight of what they broke. She smiled softly. Blake's carrying it now, and with every step, it's getting lighter. The church basement was quiet that evening. The youth group had gone home. The lights were dim. Only Miss Hattie, Blake, and Camille remained, sitting around a small table with steaming mugs of peppermint tea. Blake looked tired, but different, calmer, wiser, more aware. You ever get tired, Miss Hattie? He asked softly. Miss Hattie chuckled gently. Child, I've been tired since 1963. She slowly reached for a small wooden box beside her chair. Camille leaned in. Grandma, is that the memory box? Miss Hattie nodded. It's time. She opened it. Inside were old black and white photographs, folded letters, torn ribbons, and pins from long ago marches. She picked up one photo. It showed a young girl, maybe 16, in a Sunday dress, standing in front of a group of white police officers. That's me. The first time I ever stood face to face with a man who called me nothing but trouble. She handed it to Blake. He held the photo carefully, like it might break. You look scared, he whispered. I was, but I was more afraid of staying quiet than I was of being arrested. She pulled out a faded letter. This was from my brother. He died in '68, in Memphis. She unfolded it slowly, her hands trembling. He wrote, if we don't speak now, we'll be silent forever, and our children will suffer for it. I carry those words with me every day. Blake blinked back tears. You lost so much. Miss Hattie nodded. We all did. I saw friends beaten. I saw homes burned. I saw people disappear because they dared to be equal. She leaned back and stared at the ceiling. But the hardest part wasn't what we lost. It was what we never got to see. A world where we didn't have to fight. Blake's voice cracked. And then I showed up, and made you fight again. Miss Hattie looked at him not with anger, but with truth. You didn't make me fight, you just reminded me that the fight isn't over. She pulled out another photo. This one showed her with Martin Luther King Jr., smiling during a march in Selma. He once told me, you don't win with hate in your heart. You win by staying human in an inhuman world. Blake looked down at his hands. I don't know if I deserve to carry any of this. Your history, it's bigger than me. Miss Hattie smiled. Child, that's exactly why you must carry it. She pointed at Camille, and her, and the next generation. Because if we don't tell our stories, someone else will rewrite them. Camille leaned in. Grandma, why didn't you ever tell everyone who you were before all this happened? Miss Hattie looked out the window. Because I wasn't doing it for credit. I marched so you could live without fear. I stayed quiet because peace isn't loud, it's patient. Blake stood up and walked over to the wall. There, pinned beside the window, was a large canvas that the youth group had made. It was filled with drawings, signatures, and powerful words like, stand up, speak truth, be kind, even when it's hard. In the center was a painted image of Miss Hattie's face, surrounded by golden light. Blake stared at it. I never knew someone like you lived in this city. Miss Hattie chuckled. There are thousands like me. Some walk beside you every day. You just don't see them, until it's too late. The room fell into silence. Then Miss Hattie reached into the box one last time, and pulled out a small metal pin. It was round, old, and a little rusty. It said, I am a man. Blake read the words slowly. That's from the Memphis sanitation. Strike, right. Miss Hattie smiled proudly. You've been studying? She held it out to him. Take it. Blake hesitated. I can't. You must. Because this pin didn't just stand for workers. It stood for dignity, for being seen. Blake reached out and accepted it. It felt heavy in his hand. Not in weight, but in meaning. Later that night, Blake walked home alone. The streets were dark and quiet. He passed the mural of Miss Hattie once again. This time he stopped and whispered, I see you now. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the pin, and held it against his heart. Then he walked on. Meanwhile, inside her home, Miss Hattie sat by the window, holding a picture of her younger self. Camille asked, do you think people will forget? Again, Miss Hattie didn't answer right away. Then she said, people always forget. That's why we have to remind them. Not with anger, but with truth. She looked at her granddaughter and added, you're the next storyteller now. Don't let silence win. Camille nodded slowly. I won't. That night, the memory box sat open on the table. Its contents were old, but its stories were alive. Because now, someone new was listening, and someone new was ready to carry the truth forward. It was a bright Sunday morning in Jefferson Hill. The town square, usually quiet, was full of life. People gathered with flowers, candles, and signs. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Teenagers held homemade banners. Old men wore hats from past wars and marches. Everyone was there for one reason, to honor Miss Hattie Cole. The mayor stood at the podium, wearing a simple black suit and a white ribbon. Behind her hung a large banner with Miss Hattie's, smiling, face and the words, she stood so we could rise. Mayor Kelly cleared her throat and began, Today, we do more than celebrate a woman. We recognize a life that shaped this town, even when no one noticed. She paused, her voice shaking slightly. Hattie Cole was not just a witness to history. She made history. The crowd clapped. Some wiped away tears. From the front row, Miss Hattie, wearing a soft blue dress and white hat, sat quietly in her wheelchair. Beside her sat Camille, proudly holding her grandmother's hand, and just a few seats away sat Blake Carter. No badge, no uniform, just a man. Sitting with humility. Then the mayor called him up. A hush fell over the crowd. Blake stood slowly, walked up to the podium, and faced the people. He took a deep breath. A few weeks ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. He looked directly at Miss Hattie. I judged someone without knowing their story. I saw an old woman, not a warrior, and I hurt her. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But, instead of anger, she gave me a chance to learn, and I will spend the rest of my life honoring that chance. He pulled something from his pocket. It was the old metal pin Miss Hattie had given him. He held it high. This pin says I am a man, but today, I wear it to remind myself, we are all human first. No badge, no title, no color. Can erase that truth. The crowd clapped, slowly at first, then louder. Miss Hattie smiled gently. Camille wiped her eyes. Then the mayor stepped forward again. In honor of Miss Hattie Cole's bravery, wisdom, and service to justice, we are renaming this square Hattie Cole Plaza. A curtain dropped behind them, revealing a bronze plaque with Miss Hattie's name. Below it were the words, justice, courage, grace. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Some chanted her name softly. Hattie, Hattie, Hattie. Later, that evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Miss Hattie sat quietly in her garden. The day had been long, but beautiful. Camille brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. You did it, Grandma. Miss Hattie smiled. No, baby. We did it. She looked up at the stars slowly appearing in the sky. When I was your age, I used to dream about a day like this, but I never thought I'd live to see it. Camille leaned on her shoulder. You didn't just live to see it. You built it. Across town. Blake sat in the church basement with a group of kids from the youth group. He wasn't leading, he was listening. Tyrell asked, You gonna stay with us? Even when the cameras are gone? Blake nodded. I'm not here for cameras. I'm here to make sure I don't forget who I used to be. Maya smiled. Good, 'cause we like this version of you better. Meanwhile, news of Miss Hattie's story had spread beyond Jefferson Hill. National newspapers wrote about her. TV shows invited her to speak. Students across the country studied her name in their classrooms. She had become a living symbol of strength, dignity, and forgiveness. Not because she asked for fame, but because her story demanded to be heard. Weeks later, Miss Hattie recorded a short message for a school in another state. In the video, she said, We all make mistakes, but real courage is not in never falling, it's in getting up and choosing better. We change the world not by shouting, but by listening. The story of one small moment on a rainy street had changed everything. It reminded a town of its past. It opened the eyes of a young officer, and it gave a nation one more hero to hold on to. Not a superhero, but a quiet, wise woman, with a cane in her hand and a fire in her heart. As she looked out over her garden that evening, Miss Hattie whispered to herself, full circle. And for the first time in a long time, she felt peace.